What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Robert Louis Stevenson. Legendary author, gigantic cocaine addict. The creative life of Robert Louis Stevenson was relatively brief. In fact, Stevenson was already in his 30s when his epic novel Treasure Island brought him his first literary success. He would then go on to enjoy popular acclaim with another work that is still highly revered today, The Cautionary Tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Many of the Robert Louis Stevenson biographies that have been written focus on the various ailments that plagued the writer from a young age, reducing him to an emaciated, sickly individual who wrote much of his material while bedridden. An adventurous wanderer and seeker his entire life, Stevenson would eventually make his way to the South Pacific island of Samoa, where he lived with his wife before his untimely death on December 4, 1894, at the age of 44. He was on a cocaine binge when he wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson was a frequent user of cocaine, whether he did so in order to alleviate the plethora of health issues he was experiencing or simply because he enjoyed the effects of the drugs. In 1885, Stevenson's wife suddenly awoke him from a drug-addled nightmare, which he then went on to transcribe at length the next day. The nightmare was turned into a full-length novella in 3 days. When Stevenson asked for his wife's opinion, she was highly critical and claimed it would not be commercial enough to address their high level of debt, so he burned the manuscript. In just 3 more days, he had recomposed the manuscript into The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In less than 1 week, Stevenson had written over 60,000 words, including the manuscript that was destroyed. And while the work did not include the sex and violence found in subsequent dramatizations, it does include substantial depictions of the duality of the human personality. Positive reviews prompted the general public to purchase 40,000 copies of the book in less than 6 months, making it one of Stevenson's most popular literary works, despite the fact that bookshops initially refused to carry it. Stevenson idolized Deacon Brodie, a Scottish criminal with a dual psychopathic personality. At a young age, Stevenson became fascinated by the legendary Scottish criminal, William Deacon Brodie. Brodie seemed to live the respectable life of an 18th-century Edinburgh furniture maker, politician, and deacon. However, because his work sometimes involved installing locks and keys, Brodie also lived a secret life as a burglar while engaged in profligate sex, gambling, and alcoholism, for which he was eventually caught, condemned, and hanged. Stevenson, when he was a student, dressed like Brodie and even drank like him until he eventually collapsed, which forced him to go back to his father's house. Bedridden, he was medicated with a combination of alcohol, morphine, and opium, which only served to increase his appetite for narcotics. Stevenson's knowledge of Brodie's twisted life became the genesis for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The majority of Robert Louis Stevenson's life was spent in poor health. It is common knowledge that Stevenson was infected with nearly every disease that existed in the 19th century, with the exception of tuberculosis, which he contracted at a young age. As a result, his eventual 6,000-mile trip to California to win the hand of his love interest quickly became a battle to merely survive. Stevenson's frequent journeys to some of the world's most exotic locales also exposed him to pneumonia, bronchitis, malaria, typhus, and cholera. In the end, he died quite suddenly, probably of a stroke stemming from his chronic smoking, alcohol and coffee consumption, poor diet, and drug abuse exacerbated by the effects of meningitis on his brain. Predictably, some historians have even attempted to connect his demise to syphilis contracted in the brothels he frequented in his youth. The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson was based on a real-life criminal case. Stevenson's 1884 short story, The Body Snatcher, describes the process of corpses being stolen for use by doctors and anatomists in Edinburgh in the early 1820s. The story was loosely based on the case of an actual surgeon, Robert Knox, who paid 2 criminals for cadavers, but never inquired as to the source of the bodies. Knox's suppliers were 2 murderers, William Hare and William Burke, who were implicated in the deliberate killings of 16 individuals that were then sold to Knox. Although he escaped prosecution, Knox's reputation was ruined by the uproar over the incident, and he was forced to leave Scotland. Stevenson's short story appeared in the Pall Mall Gazette newspaper, and was eventually adapted into a 1945 film starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Stevenson spent time in California in pursuit of his future wife. On one of his journeys to France, Robert Louis Stevenson met Frances Osborne, a married but separated American woman who, along with two of her children, was living in Paris studying art. Although the two became quite friendly and Fanny encouraged Stevenson to pursue his writing, she ultimately left Paris and Stevenson behind. Clearly smitten, and against the advice of his friends and parents, Stevenson announced that he wished to travel to California to pursue the relationship. Stevenson had to pay for his own way because his parents refused to pay for the trip, which was a barrier that took months to overcome. Stevenson's chronically ill health worsened even more after a trip across the Atlantic and a train ride across the United States. Initially torn between returning to her perpetually unfaithful husband and her broke but persistent suitor, Fanny Osborne ultimately decided to marry Stevenson in San Francisco on May 19, 1880. Also, his wife was a little off. Frances van de Grift Osborne, nicknamed Fanny, was certainly a kindred spirit to the perpetually restless and iconoclastic Stevenson. Only 17 when she married her first husband, Sam, an officer enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. She gave birth to her first child Isabel 2 years later. Fanny trekked through Panama to San Francisco and then to Nevada's mining camps, where she joined her husband as he went to Nevada to mine for silver and gold. The family eventually moved to San Francisco and had 2 more sons. However, depressed by her husband's philandering ways, in 1875, Fanny decided to travel to France with her children to study art with her daughter. Sadly, soon after they arrived in Paris, one of her sons fell ill and died from tuberculosis. She and her remaining children relocated to a small village near Barbizon to heal from her loss, where she eventually met Robert Louis Stevenson. Fanny returned to California in 1878, conflicted by her growing affection for the writer but still legally married, only to later divorce her husband when Stevenson showed up on her doorstep. Stevenson's relationship with his parents was difficult. Stevenson was constantly at odds with his parents over his professional life and what they considered his profligate ways. It was not as if Stevenson's parents developed a great hatred or dislike for their son. Instead, they were deeply concerned by his behavior, which they considered to be godless and self-destructive. His father, Thomas Stevenson, was a civil engineer and lighthouse designer who was deeply distressed when his son showed no interest in following in his footsteps. At Edinburgh University, Stevenson was the ringleader of a club that maintained the motto, "Ignore everything our parents taught us." Probably to please his parents, Stevenson studied to become a lawyer, but never actively pursued the profession. By the time he had written Treasure Island, as a married man in his early 30s, he was still being financially supported by his parents. Born in Scotland, Stevenson lived as a vagabond. Much of Stevenson's adult life was spent exploring exotic locales, with his wanderings frequently being dictated by both his search for a healthier climate and material for the travelogues he produced. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and afflicted with chronic respiratory issues, Stevenson initially wrote about central France after taking a canoeing trip with a friend, and in 1879, he also wrote Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes, a description of his trek across France with a pack animal named Modestini. His journey across America by train was described in the 1883, Across the Plains, Leaves from the Notebook of an Emigrant between New York and San Francisco. Stevenson would sail on a small trading schooner to the Gilbert Islands and Samoa in search of even more temperate climates in Polynesia and the faraway Pacific as his health deteriorated. Stevenson's description of the voyage and his reflections on the region resulted in the posthumous, In the South Seas. Stevenson wrote Treasure Island under a pseudonym. Stevenson's first major literary achievement was Treasure Island. Originally conceived from a map that he had drawn for his young stepson about a make-believe island, Stevenson began to develop a children's story from it about pirates and buried treasure. A literary journal for boys called Young Folks agreed to publish the story in weekly installments, but Stevenson was concerned about the work's reception and published it under the pseudonym Captain George North. After the serialization of the story was concluded, The manuscript was officially published in book form in November of 1883. It quickly became quite successful based on the favorable reviews it received, overcoming the initial disapproval of its young magazine audience. Stevenson never explained why the book was published under a pseudonym, but one theory states that his already contentious relationship with his parents would have been exacerbated if his public literary failure had tarnished the family name. Robert Louis Stevenson died in Samoa and was buried there with great respect. 1889 marks Stevenson's first trip to Samoa with his wife. He was so impressed by the region that he immediately purchased 300 acres of land and built a two-story house, which he named Velima. Although the house was the center of a small expatriate community, life there was austere and conditions were harsh. Stevenson was a vocal and financially generous supporter of the Samoan people during the European colonial powers' attempts to subjugate them. Despite his aid, the island would eventually be annexed to Germany, but Stevenson earned eternal gratitude and the tribal name of Tusitala, the teller of tales. Upon Stevenson's death, his remains were taken by natives to the summit of nearby Mt. Via, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. His epitaph reads, "Under the vast star-filled sky dig the grave and let me lie. I was glad to live and glad to die. And I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. The sailor's home comes from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill." When Stevenson's wife died in Santa Barbara, California in 1914, her ashes were taken to the island and buried next to her husband. Stevens' potential masterpiece, The Weir of Hermiston, was published posthumously. Much of Stevenson's work was published posthumously, including The Weir of Hermiston, which was released in 1896. Predictably, it involves the banishment of a rebellious son by his strict jurist father over what the son publicly considers to be a harsh sentence. The book contains both a dramatically improved prose style and engaging dialogue, but unfortunately Stevenson was unable to finish the manuscript and had actually been working on it on the morning of his death. Initial editions contained an editor's note with a brief synopsis of how Stevenson intended the work to end, with the main character sentenced to death by his own father after he murders another man for betrayal. This was obviously a not too deeply disguised examination of Stevenson's relationship with his own father. Stevenson wholeheartedly embraced atheism. Stevenson's atheism, which he openly professed, was a constant source of contention for his parents. When his father first discovered some of his written comments concerning his spiritual outlook, Stevenson explained emphatically that he no longer believed in the Christian faith. His father was shocked and responded by saying, "You have rendered my whole life a failure." Stevenson was not moved by his father's dramatic response. He wrote subsequently to a friend, "It was really pathetic to hear my father praying pointedly for me today at family worship, and to think the poor man's supplications were addressed to nothing better able to hear and answer than the chandelier." Stevenson's attitudes toward religion would remain constant throughout his life. Robert Louis Stevenson, legendary author, gigantic cocaine addict. Robert Louis Stevenson was a paradox, a frail, sickly wanderer who wrote thunderous tales of pirates, monsters, and murderers, a drug-fueled visionary who painted Victorian morality in blood and shadows, a literary celebrity who defied his doctor's orders and society's expectations by chasing his muse through brothels, opium dens, and across oceans. Born in 1850 in Edinburgh, Scotland, Stevenson's early life was steeped in piety and Presbyterian restraint, but even as a child, he rebelled against the prim ideals of his well-to-do engineering family. Robert Louis Stevenson was the son of Thomas Stevenson, a well-known lighthouse designer. As a child, he was sensitive to cold, allergic to sunlight, and had long-term lung issues that would plague him for the rest of his life. However, the boy who had fevered dreams for weeks became one of the most explosive and daring writers of the 19th century, and this was not just due to the stories he wrote. Stevenson's legendary status wasn't solely due to the longevity of his tales like Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. The man lived as if he were one of his own characters, teetering between genius and madness, sainthood and damnation, Jekyll and Hyde. Hence the name Hyde, however. He was known to write while high on cocaine, hallucinating entire chapters in a single night. He used laudanum, morphine, opium, hashish, and God knows what else, sometimes prescribed for his consumption but often indulged recreationally. But far from isolating himself, Stevenson filled his life with reckless encounters, long absinthe benders, and periods of productivity so intense they seemed almost supernatural. While many writers of his era struggled for recognition, Stevenson caught fire with Treasure Island, a novel that began as a bedtime story for his stepson and quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Published in 1883, it introduced Long John Silver, pirate maps, and X marks the spot into the popular imagination. However, his body was deteriorating as his fame grew. Between 1880 and his death in 1894, Stevenson suffered more health crises than most people endure in a lifetime. He had cholera, malaria, dengue fever, typhoid, and several other infections that had not been diagnosed. His cough became so constant it shook his frame. Alcohol, opium, and yes, cocaine were all prescribed by Victorian doctors as cures for everything from asthma to boredom. Stevenson experimented with these substances rather than simply taking them. Friends noted his wild eyes and frenetic bursts of writing. He did not exaggerate when he once stated, "I have written 10,000 words a day while high." While high, the man wrote faster than most people could read. He was a torrent of literature. Stevenson moved to the South Pacific with Fanny in his later years, settling on the island of Upolu in Samoa. There he was known as Tusitala, the teller of tales. He was adored by the Samoans. He built a house himself and fought for their rights against colonial powers. However, Stevenson's body continued to deceive him even in paradise. He suffered from chronic bleeding, neural pain, and dizziness, and he often took morphine to sleep. After opening a bottle of wine on December 3, 1894, Stevenson turned to his wife and asked, "Does my face look strange?" He collapsed shortly after from what appeared to be a significant cerebral hemorrhage. He was just 44 years old when he passed away at night. Finally, his battered lungs, cocaine-ravaged brain, and heart had given out. The legacy of Robert Louis Stevenson has frequently been filtered down to quaint tales of pirates and horror suitable for school reading lists. But the truth of his life is far wilder and stranger than anything in his fiction. He lived like a man on fire, chasing ideas across continents, hallucinating monsters, idolizing criminals, falling in love with a married woman 11 years his senior, and riding the razor's edge of genius and collapse. He once wrote, "To travel hopefully is a better thing than to arrive," and he never stopped moving, thinking, or snorting whatever kept his pen moving. In that spirit he never stopped moving. He was like Icarus in literature, soaring to greatness but being consumed by his own ambition and addiction. And for all his ailments and addictions, Stevenson never let the world define him as a weak man. Instead, he redefined what strength meant, not through brawn or conformity, but through unyielding defiance, poetic vision, and the willingness to plunge into the darkest corners of the human soul and come back with something beautiful. Biographers estimate he wrote the entire original version of Jekyll and Hyde, over 60,000 words, in just 3 days, while on an unbroken cocaine binge. Frances Fanny Osborne read it and threw it in the fireplace because she was so horrified by its dark content and lack of commercial appeal. Stevenson didn't argue. He simply started again, allegedly fueled by another burst of powdered inspiration, and completed the new version in another 3 days. Stevenson saw the duality of man, the horror of the self, and the psychological tension between repression and indulgence as lived experiences that were brought to life by drug-fueled nights and a lifelong obsession with people who lived 2 lives. One of his earliest fascinations was William Deacon Brodie, an 18th-century Scottish cabinetmaker and city councilman by day, who spent his nights as a gambler, philanderer, and burglar. Brodie lived a double life so effectively that he was only caught after years of stealing from the very people who trusted him with their homes. Stevenson idolized this figure, even dressing like him as a student. Brodie was the original Jekyll and Hyde, and Stevenson absorbed his story deeply, just as he would absorb morphine into his veins. From a young age, Stevenson was sick, probably with tuberculosis, and doctors told him he'd be lucky to live to 30. The persistent coughing, high fevers, and hemorrhaging lungs made any notion of a conventional life impossible. He instead turned to drugs, literature, and wandering. He frequently attributed his wild experiments and erratic decisions to his illness, which he discussed with grim humor. His travels, which took him from the wind-swept highlands of Scotland to the jungles of Samoa, were rarely undertaken from a sense of leisure. He moved constantly in search of climates that might prolong his life, even marginally.